Hey, everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis's Deep Dive, where we're looking out for you. We're giving you the information that you're not going to get on any major network television station, because they're always telling you what they want you to know, not necessarily what you do need to know. And we're going to give you the inside information that you need to really be able to understand what's going on around you, despite what you may be told on some of the major news stories. Well, in today's episode, we have a real treat. We have a good friend of mine, Harry Kazianis. He is the president of the Rogue States Group and the senior editor at the national security publication 1945. And Harry has been on, numerous television shows. You've probably seen him on Fox News.
Think about this. The United States this year will spend
Fox News and several other kind of channels on BBC and CNBC. I think he's been on all kinds of things. And he's going to be joining us here from his home in Florida. And Harry, welcome to the show.
Hey, Danny, always good to be with you, my friend.
You know what, Harry, we're going to talk today about an issue that was in the news here recently, quite a bit for a while there. And a lot of people don't really know what to make about it. And that was when Kim Jong-un went to visit Vladimir Putin. And it actually started a little bit earlier than that, back in July, I think, when the Minister of Defense for Russia, Sergei Shoigu, went to Pyongyang and was feted by Kim Jong-un at that time, part of their celebration of the end of the Korean War, and raised lots of eyebrows. And I want to get into it because you're one of the best-known subject matter experts in the issue, especially in the Asia Pacific, but also on this the war going on in Russia right now as a product of your used to being with the national interest and the Center for the National Interest, many decades in Washington. And for you, those who don't know, I mean, Harry's advice has been sought by administrations, both on the left and the right, because his advice is greatly sought, because he's very knowledgeable about things that are going on, especially in North Korea, where he's got a long track record of calling the shots correctly in there. So to bring everybody up to date, Harry, let me play a little short clip from CNN that kind of sets the stage for what the public has been hearing on the major news media. Let's play that clip.
North Korea and Russia have parted ways after a high-stakes summit in far eastern Russia, but they may meet again soon as their countries deepen ties. North Korean state media report Vladimir Putin has cordially accepted an invitation to visit Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang at a time which is convenient. No official word on when that will happen. For now, it's believed the North Korean leader is still somewhere in Russia aboard his train. According to Russian President Vladimir Putin and Russian state media, Kim will visit key military sites as well as an industrial center and head to Vladivostok and observe Russia's Pacific Fleet.
At a remote space center in Russia's Far East, the bizarre New World Order got even weirder on Wednesday. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and Russian President Vladimir Putin becoming allies against the West.
We are certain that the Russian people and its military will emerge victorious in the fight to punish the evil forces that ambitiously pursue hegemony and expansion.
Putin and Kim vowing stronger ties, a long-standing strategic relationship, joining forces to find a way around crippling UN sanctions.
In the front line of anti-imperialism and independence, I will always be standing with Russia. I'm using this opportunity to make it clear.
Back in 2018, Kim and Trump were discussing a deal to denuclearize North Korea.
Will you invite Chairman Kim to the White House?
Absolutely, I will.
You know, Harry, interesting on that. One of the phrases the reporter used there was this bizarre new world order. And, it's bizarre in the sense that it's not the way we've had it before, because, kind of up to this point, you've had, the four big enemies of the United States that we love to demonize and go after, which, of course, is Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Well, pretty much, at least before this war started, Russia that was kind of kept a distance between both Iran and North Korea because they had a lot to lose, frankly, with a lot of the Western economic interests and so forth. But now, all of a sudden, with this maximum sanctions policy we have now on Russia, is that seems to have taken away a lot of our leverage and taken away a lot of the risk for Russia to actually work closer with those people, with those countries especially. And they seem to be getting closer with China, Iran, and now North Korea. So the question is that I want to ask you first is, Why now? What is it that's happened over, a year and a half of the war that suddenly Ukraine and Russia, I'm sorry, that Russia and North Korea want to actually have an open relationship and talk openly about potential military maneuvers in the future and also weapons productions? And where do you think this is going?
Dan, you said a key phrase that's very interesting: an open relationship. The North Koreans and then the old Soviet Union had a very open relationship going back to the 1940s during the Korean War. Obviously, Stalin greenlit that war, and that's why the Korean Peninsula is divided to this day. But it was a closed relationship, if you will, when obviously the Soviet Union fell apart. And I just want to tell a little bit of history here, because I think it colors the conversation. It explains where this is and then where it's going. Keep in mind, the North Koreans have a nuclear program because the Soviet Union helped them start that nuclear program. It was in the 1950s that the Soviet Union gave Kim Il-sung a nuclear research reactor. It's very small, but it allowed them to start building up their nuclear muscles, if you will, and start moving towards a nuclear weapons program. It was Soviet scientists that helped the North Koreans through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s to build a nuclear infrastructure, to have nuclear scientists, for North Korean engineers to study in the Soviet Union and learn about atomic technology, about light water reactors, about how to use radiation and things like that to treat cancer in North Korea. So there's a lot of ties there when it comes to the nuclear program. On the civilian side, we don't know so much about the nuclear side, but I want to touch on that. Now that the United States has an extremely adversarial relationship with China and now with Russia, that gives the North Koreans an opening to now have an open relationship with you, if you will, with the Russians. And what I mean by that is probably in the 2000s and 2010s, I have a pretty degree of certainty that the North Koreans were stealing a lot of Russian military technology. There's some excellent reporting.
Actually stealing.
Yeah. If you go back to a lot of reporting that was done from the New York Times back in the 2010s, I think it was 2016, 2017, it's really fascinating reporting that the North Korean agents were in actually Ukraine and going through a lot of old Soviet missile production facilities, things like that, missiles that the United States probably doesn't care about because they have 1960s, 70s, and 80s, military technology foundations. But for the North Koreans, it's a gold mine. And it's kind of interesting, how did the North Koreans go from the early 2010s, from their missiles exploding on the launch pad and testing over and over again and having all these different missile failures, to all of a sudden in 2016, 2017, 2018 into the present, having all this success, building heavy ICBMs, liquid fueled ICBMs, very advanced weaponry. Where did it come from? I mean, obviously some of that came from Ukraine, but a lot of it came, I think, from probably Russian engineers that went to North Korea unauthorized, probably a lot of bribes that were paid. And it's just my guess that if you just look at the backbone of North Korean military technology, almost all of it looks like it came from Russia. I mean, it looks like Russian military technology.
So behind this, if behind the scenes, North Korea was stealing Russian technology, or getting it without paying for it, or even letting Russia know. What changed from say the 2010 to 2015, 2018 timeframe until now, to where now they seem to have moved back into more cooperation openly with Moscow? Is that because Moscow had to, because of the war situation right here, or was there anything else that developed in between, say, 2017 and the start of this war?
Well, I think the war in Ukraine obviously opened up the floodgates to open cooperation. I mean, as the war in Ukraine has sort of gone on, I think it's very clear Vladimir Putin thought he was going to win this war very quickly. When that didn't happen, obviously, and you can tell this tale better than I can, that the Russians moved through other ammunition stocks very, very quickly. Their industrial capacity isn't what we thought it was. They're not able to produce, tens of thousands of artillery shells per day that they would need to fight that war. There's been a lot of reporting, and you can count it or discount it, about how many artillery shells are actually firing. And they needed more sources of Soviet Union style artillery shells, to make sure those calibers match up to something that they can put in their artillery and actually fire at the Ukrainians. There's not a lot of places where you can get that from, but there's one really big one you can get that from, and that's North Korea. The North Koreans more than likely have millions of backloaded artillery shells that are sitting in storage waiting for the Second Korean War. And
Well, yeah,
because of
that's what I was going to ask you, especially on that point, because North Korea's military doctrine itself is very heavily reliant on artillery, has always been, because of the terrain and the nature of the war that would likely happen in the event that they did go to war with South Korea. So do you have any sense at all for how many artillery shells North Korea may have in inventory that they could even afford to give Russia?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. Speaking to a lot of retired ROK or South Korean military officials, what they've told me on background is that the North Koreans could afford to give probably several million older 1950s,
Wow.
1960s, or 1970s built artillery shells. But here's the thing, as you know, being in the Army, Danny, if you don't maintain those stocks, if you don't check those stocks, if you just throw them in a warehouse and allow them to atrophy and, storms get in there, if there's corrosion, what is how successful will those artillery shells be in the battlefield? Will they be accurate? Will they fire? Will you have dangerous misfires? What happens to the artillery tubes? How dirty is the ammo that you're firing in those artillery tubes? So there's a lot of questions we just can't answer. But my guess would be Putin would take those artillery shells, even if the failure rate is 1 in 4. I mean, they get 4 million artillery shells, and the failure rate is something like 25%. It's still a lot of ammo you can throw at Ukraine. And I think what would end up happening is that the North Koreans would sell those goods, and I think they would create some sort of deal with the Russians, probably secretive, that would allow them to rebuild their industrial capacity to produce a lot more artillery shells. And then what they'd be able to do is keep some of that for themselves, replenish those artillery shells and have much newer stocks, but also sell whatever they can back to Russia through train and then truck it up through the Far East and Siberia into the front. So I think
what time frame do you think that? I mean, is that something that would take, a half a year to do, 18 months to do? How long would it take for something like that to even get into operational capacity?
I think if we suspect this is going to be a long war, which I think you're probably looking at a 2 to 3 year timeline before this burns out. We can always talk about that more. I think you're probably looking at about a 9-month to 18-month time frame where they'd be able to produce a lot of ammunition quickly. I think it really just depends on resources. If the Russians don't care that they get caught on satellite imagery, actually helping stand up factories in North Korea, and they don't care about the PR damage, they might even be able to do a lot quicker. So what it really comes down to is what's the PR hit? How much is it going to cost? And if those things can be worked out, North Korea could be the arsenal that powers, at least the artillery factor when it comes to the Russian side of the war.
Now, another interesting aspect of this, Harry, that I want to talk about, because I think this is right in your wheelhouse, that hardly anybody in America knows, and you'd really never even hear this mentioned on a typical newscast. It's got a 3.5-minute segment. And how does the China card play in the middle of this? Because China has a very awkward relationship with North Korea. Many the common knowledge here in the United States is that it's like hand in glove, lips and teeth, I think is how they sometimes say it in public. But behind the scenes, apparently there's a lot of friction between North Korea and China itself. And we've seen that there's closeness between Russia and China, but it's not this close. There's a little bit of distance. And so what is the China interest in all this, and how they manage relationships with both Moscow and Pyongyang?
It's complicated. To put it bluntly, the first thing I think we need to understand is North Korea does not exist without Chinese aid, Chinese support. The level of money and resources that China puts into North Korea is within probably in the tens of billions of dollars per year. Give you a quick example. North Korea has one pipeline that is completely reliant on for most of its oil coming out of China. And one thing during the Trump years that was attempted was Trump administration officials were really pushing on the Chinese to close this one pipeline. They never would. And technically, I'm sure that pipeline is pumping out way more oil than the amount that is allowed by international sanctions. In fact, we don't even have a way to know how much oil is coming out of that pipeline. So the Chinese could be completely busting the sanctions and we wouldn't know, which actually brings me to another point. The Chinese completely control the whole, remember, maximum pressure sanctions that the Trump administration was trying to put on North Korea.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. 90% of North Korea's imports and exports go through China. So effectively, we have no way to enforce any sort of sanctions on North Korea whatsoever, unless you're talking about, barges that are going into North Korea and offloading and taking in goods and pumping out exports. But almost all trade is done through China and through that border. So we have no effective way to really stop this. And the other thing I would say is that anytime we have any sort of ruptures or challenges with China, whether it's Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, trade, finance, intellectual property theft, whatever. The problem here is that they can always weaken the sanctions on North Korea and essentially take the reins off Kim Jong-un anytime they want to. So this is really the big problem with North Korea, because it's always going to be a challenge in a comprehensive Asia strategy when, if you want to get as hawkish as you want on China, the problem is you're always going to have to contend with a North Korea that China can basically unleash at a moment's notice. It can tell the North Koreans, well, we're having a lot of problems in the United States right now. Why don't you go ahead and do a nuclear test? Or why don't you do another heavy ICBM test? Or, maybe we'll leak some new technology to you so you can have MERV to ICBMs. In other words, ICBMs that have multiple warheads for reentry. So one ICBM effectively can have 4 or 5 warheads at the top. So these are the challenges we face, because even though historically the Chinese and the North Koreans don't have a great love affair with each other, they kind of need each other, and that's what makes it very complicated.
And so let's take a real quick diversion from this while we're right here on China and North Korea, because another distant influencing factor that could play into all of this, at least into the future, is the curiosity of in the event that China thought it was even thinking about moving against Taiwan. And for the moment here, let's not talk about whether they will or won't, but let's just say that if they do, to what extent might they be able to use North Korea to either cause us problems, cause us diversions, help Russia or whatever? How might they use that? Because it's not merely a matter of picking up a tool and using it against us, because that tool has a mind of its own. And so the question is, how far would North Korea go to assist China in the event that they wanted to do something in Taiwan? Is there a leverage that each of them would have, that they both have common interest in not helping us?
It gets very sloppy. I mean, it creates a whole bunch of problems for the United States, China, North Korea, obviously Taiwan. I mean, the first thing is if, let's say, the United States didn't intervene, which there's universal opinion here in Washington that is probably what would happen. To what extent, whether that means the U.S. sending forces, who knows? That's a longer conversation. But the United States would most likely want to use South Korean bases and our weapons that we have in South Korea to use in a Taiwan scenario. South Korean governments may have some problems with that, obviously. Then you obviously moving to North Korea, the North Koreans would obviously have huge problems with that. And I would assume would start ramping up missile tests immediately. They might think that now this is the time to do a nuclear test, because they feel like the eyes of the world wouldn't be on them, and they could really, test to see where their warhead technology goes. I mean, they might even try to do things like a full Pacific ICBM test, where they literally lob an ICBM, 14,000 kilometers deep in the Pacific, somewhere near Fiji or something, to really test how an ICBM would go. So the North Koreans at that point, I think, would do whatever they wanted, because they'd feel like they could. And I think also, depending on if we get into a wider war in Taiwan, if it becomes like a Ukraine scenario where it could last years, the Chinese might go to the North Koreans and ask them to provide aid. And you could even see, North Korean volunteers, if you will, going to the Chinese side and helping them.
Reverse 1953.
Yeah.
Or 1950, yeah.
Yeah, history repeats itself.
I could certainly see that. Okay, so let's jumping back into the topic of the day here. Okay, so we certainly know what Russia would benefit from any kind of cooperation with North Korea. What does North Korea get out of this? What do they benefit, other than maybe getting some cash for the artillery shells? But what is their motivation? And again, why now? Why now as opposed to 6 months ago or a year ago? Why right now?
Let me frame it up this way. How does a country like North Korea, which it's poor, it's one of the poorest countries on the planet, it can't feed its own people, contrary to whatever the media says, they were decimated by COVID-19. I'm sure hundreds of thousands of North Koreans died in the most worst ways.
Really?
Yeah. Their economy is literally, in terms of GDP, 1/3 the size of Ethiopia. So think about that. How does a country like that build nuclear weapons, ICBMs, chemical weapons, biological weapons? How do they have all that? Well, they lie, cheat, and steal from everywhere they can to get the technology they need. But again, going back to the original part of our conversation, Danny, I'm sure a lot of this technology was stolen from Russia, from Ukraine, from old Soviet satellites, and they've cobbled a lot of it together. But if they were allowed to have a lot more open access, if you will, to Russian technology, which is what they want, which is definitely what they want. And I think they've been getting that more over the last 18 months since the Ukraine war started, especially since the North Koreans have allegedly been giving the Wagner Group arms. I'm sure they were allowed some sort of technology for that. I mean, money is important to Kim Jong-un, but he wants the tech. He wants to build a viable nuclear deterrent to ensure the United States will never invade his country, to make it so painful that a nuclear battlefield isn't something the United States is going to want to fight on. That's what he wants. So I think really for the North Koreans, they want access to much more up-to-date old Soviet military technology. They don't want the latest and greatest at what the Russians have. I think what they'd be focusing on is improving their 1970s and 1980s technology when it comes to missiles, ensuring that they can get bigger payloads on their ICBMs, and fundamentally making sure that their nuclear warheads, when they fire them and they go to the atmosphere, that they can survive atmospheric reentry. That's really important to them. According to open source, research that's out there, Danny, the North Koreans have never tested that out in the open field. So they do. There's probably a hesitancy there that their warheads would survive atmospheric reentry, unless there's been a test and it never was made public. But they want the tech. That's really what's important to them.
Makes a lot of sense.
I'm sure if Putin goes to North Korea, you bet your bottom dollar they got some good tech goodies for it.
Right. At the really since the end of the Trump administration, there hasn't been any talk much about the size of the nuclear arsenal for North Korea. And at the time they said, potentially around 60 warheads. Well, we're now 3 years later, basically. Do you have any sense for what the current capacity is in terms of nuclear warheads for North Korea?
I don't think it's huge. I think it's anywhere in the realm from probably about 40 to 60. I think that reporting's still accurate. I think what's more dangerous, Danny, is that the size of the North Korean nuclear industry and overall capacity. I mean, this is a nuclear program that has probably thousands of different buildings that are earmarked for nuclear development, 10,000 scientists or more, probably a support staff of 20 to 30,000 on top of the scientists. This is a very, very large nuclear program. So I always get very upset when people say, oh, the North Koreans will give up this nuclear program. We can find the right incentive structure to do it, or the right sanctions. They've made it clear through the investments, through billions of dollars that they've put into this program. And quite frankly, the amount of North Korean lives that have been lost because they're not feeding their people to feed this program, they're never going to give that program up. So
and of course, that makes it real easy to have the bloody nose strategy. We'll just take out a couple of shots and bam, their program will be gone. All we got, actually, it's spread out everywhere. So you're not going to take it out, which I guess is the reason they built it that way.
Exactly. They diversified all of the facilities. A lot of it's underground. I mean, we'll never have an idea of how many warheads, but they would need to have enough warheads for a devastating first strike. I mean, that is North Korean nuclear strategy. If they felt that the United States was gearing up for some sort of regime change war, and they felt that was in the offing, they would destroy the ports at Busan. They would destroy Seoul. They would destroy South Korea's industrial capacity, technological capacity, and make it very hard for the United States to fight their way back in. I mean, essentially, the North Korean plan would be to kill millions of people in what would be the biggest and most suicidal type of deterrence you would ever imagine. Of course, the North Koreans don't stop and think that U.S. nuclear strategy would be to essentially wipe them out 20 minutes later. But, who said nuclear war is rational?
Right. That's my biggest fear on that. That there's too many people. And look, Harry, I see this a lot in the West. There's too cavalier view towards nuclear weapons. And it's like, no, we might launch some, but then they would understand and that the risk would be too high and wouldn't retaliate. That's just nonsense. That's exactly what you just said there. It's not a rational thought that, I can use it safely and the other side can't. And man, all you need is one side to be irrational like that. And it's a big trouble for us all, and God help us if that day ever shows up.
Absolutely.
Hey, one last thing I want to talk about here on this topic before I let you go. There was some interesting things in that CNN clip I showed you there toward the end. It made a contrast between the attempt by the Trump administration, earlier in his tenure, to have work with Kim Jong-un, and famously met him all those times for the purpose of denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. And at least rhetorically, North Korea was willing to entertain that possibility. And if we hadn't have, basically committed diplomatic suicide in how we handle that, especially at the infamous meeting there in Hanoi, who knows if it would have been able to inch along or not, but it completely ended at that point. Now then, after we basically didn't do anything, the remainder of the Trump administration and the Biden administration seems to have taken a decision from the beginning to basically ignore North Korea, not even attempt to engage with them diplomacy. Now then that you have this open cooperation between Putin and Kim Jong-un, it seems like that has more potential for the North Korean side to bear fruit than what he had tried here. And I wonder if you could just talk about those two contrasting dynamics and what that may mean going forward.
Yeah, I mean, for the United States, the Biden administration came in essentially. You hit the nail on the head. The policy is to ignore North Korea. I think for Team Biden, their understanding of the North Korea issue is that in order to have any sort of fundamental change on the North Korean side, you have to make a fundamental choice, and the choice is North Korea is never going to give up its nuclear weapons. It's never going to happen. I mean, we can go through multiple videos on why, but the point is they're never going to do it. It's just that for North Korea, they have declared it in so many different ways to us. We kind of ignore them, but they basically said that this is their only way to ensure their survival, whether it comes from the United States, whether it comes from even a threat from China or Russia or any other big power. I mean, North Korea is sandwiched between South Korea, China, Russia. They feel a lot of fear from all these great powers. So they're never giving those weapons up. And the only way that you can create a safer dynamic on the Korean Peninsula is maybe not necessarily to admit that fact. I mean, that's political suicide. I mean, this is why the Biden administration, I think,
you can't tell the truth, Harry. What are you talking about? What's going on?
This is the deep dive. We can tell all the truth we want.
We can.
The challenge is, though, is that since they're never going to give those weapons up, it's political suicide for whoever engages in that. So the only way to really do this for a future administration, maybe a future Trump administration, is to take the idea of denuclearization and move it into like an aspirational goal, to say our overall goal that we agree on is the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula or North Korea, whatever. I know we get into these naming games. And then start to work out a common framework where both sides de-escalate in a lot of small ways. That was started under Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un when they tried to demilitarize the demilitarized zone, essentially, if you will, to really move a lot of forces out. And that was good. That was a really good first step, if you recall. But we're going to have to work in conventional means, in conventional arms first, working our way up to nuclear weapons, if that is even a possibility. But the thing is this, if I'm Kim Jong-un and I'm getting fat and happy from Russia, I'm getting all this technology, probably getting the Russians to bust sanctions, the Chinese are busting sanctions. Kim Jong-un I bet is probably in the best place he's been since right before COVID. What does he gain from negotiating with the United States? What is the United States going to give him that's better from Russia and China? There's nothing they can give them. So there's no hope for diplomacy right now, unfortunately. And that's
not. And I think this is one of the biggest fears that I've always had about our lack of willingness to engage diplomatically, is that now then we've given the North Korean side no motivation, no incentive whatsoever to even think about moving in our direction. And it would take a dramatic turnaround from the United States and from Russia at this point to change the dynamics, to make any of those even aspirational talks you mentioned possible. Now, it is so far down the road, it's going to take so much of a change in Washington, which of course is not even on the horizon. That's not even visible that anyone would think about doing any of those things. And now then we're reaping the rewards for our poor diplomatic decisions made over, quite frankly, decades, but certainly over the last 5 to 7 years, spanning the last of the Trump administration up to the current day. And especially if North Korea has some success here and they get some real benefit from this new cooperation with Russia, I mean, it's just going to continue to move in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and I think the only way I see things changing is if the war in Ukraine sort of goes on a sort of an extended pause, or ends up becoming like it was back in 2014, border clash type scenario. The Russians may not have as much need for the North Koreans and their armaments, and that relationship could sort of go back to the way it was as it was in the early 2000s. Then if you have the Chinese economy start to have a lot of problems and China starts to go inward, maybe not focusing so much on, creating trouble in the South China Sea or Taiwan, you could have an international dynamic where North Korea starts to begin to look for more help from outside sources. Remember, the North Koreans are very crafty in their diplomacy. They don't really care so much who they get aid and help from, as long as they get it. As long as the Kim regime can survive, as long as the 800,000 or 900,000, party cadres that live in Pyongyang that run the country can survive and are fat and happy, I don't think they really care where the money comes from or the resources come from. And I think if there's an international shift in the environment against them, I think they would look to diplomacy. But right now, that's as good as dead.
Well, at least there's a ray of hope if we ever get sane and decide to use diplomacy. At least there's the potential for something. I guess we can take some solace in that, even though it's not a lot. But Eric Katsianis, thank you so much for joining us on Deep Dive. This has been really, I think, our best episode to date, and just illustrates to all of our audience why Deep Dive is so necessary, because we're giving you information you're just not going to get on the major media, because our only objective is to tell you the truth about what's really going on. Be sure to like this video, share it, and by all means, tell your friends about it. And we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.